The Villisca Axe murders are one of the darkest and most mysterious cases of the 20th century. Despite persistent and sometimes obsessive attempts to find a solution to it. However, it will remain a challenge facing the most senior and powerful investigators, and it will be preserved in the records of the United States of America as the greatest mystery it has faced in its history. On the morning of June 10, 1912, as the sun took its place on the horizon, Mrs. Mary Peckham was beginning her day with her usual household chores when she noticed, unusually, the quiet surrounding the home of her neighbors, the Moore family. A bit of curiosity crept into her, so she decided to go check them out. I knocked on the door repeatedly, but there was no answer. She also noticed that the animals in the barn were still in their cages, so she quickly released them. She was also concerned about the unusual situation in the house, so she hurried to call Mr. Ross Moore, brother of the head of the family, Josiah. The man came and knocked on the door and windows and shouted and called the names of all the family members, but to no avail. Fortunately for him, or perhaps unfortunately, he had a spare key with which he opened the door and entered the house while Mrs. Peckham waited for him on the balcony. I wish he had not done so because as soon as he went downstairs to the guest room, he noticed that under the bed covert 2 people were lying. Blood was spread everywhere. Controlling himself as best he could, he carefully moved away from the crime scene. Then he shouted to Mrs. Peckham to call Marshal Henry Horton immediately, because something terrible had happened. When the marshal arrived and toured the house, he saw scenes that silenced tongues. It was found that the entire Moore family, in addition to 2 guest girls, were killed in a horrific and brutal manner. In Iowa City, in the Midwest of America, and in the peaceful and prosperous town of Villisca, where many establishments, companies, and businesses spread, the Moores lived. It is a family consisting of 6 members. The father is local businessman Josiah Moore, 43 years old, his wife Sarah Montigri, 39 years old, and his 4 children, Herman, 11 years old, Mary, 10 years old, Arthur, 7 years old, and Paul, 5 years old. Josiah and Sarah married in 1899 and lived together for 13 years until the date of their murder. Spouses Josiah and Sarah Moore. The family bought their home in Villisca in 1903. They were a well-known and respected family, and they were well-liked among the townspeople. They have a say in it and participate and supervise many events and gatherings. On the night of the crime, exactly on the 9th of June, Children's Day activities were held inside the church, which is an annual event that the town used to celebrate, for students to participate and give speeches about this day. That night, the party was supervised by Mrs. Sarah Moore. When it finished around 9:30, the girl, Mary Catherine, invited her friends Ina and Lena Stillinger to spend the night with her at home. Sarah Moore had no choice but to contact the girl's family to obtain permission. The older sister replied, saying that her parents were not at home and that she had no problem with the 2 girls spending the night with them, a decision that the girl later regretted until the end of her life. No one who knew the family knew that it would be the last night they would see them and the Stillinger girls. After their return, the house was silent. No one saw the Moores until the next morning, when their bodies were found with their 2 visitors at their residence. Presbyterian Church, the last place the Moore family and the 2 girls were seen. For investigations into the Villisca Axe murders. Upon inspection of the crime scene, investigation, and examinations by doctors, the report data concluded that everyone was killed with an axe owned by Mr. Josiah. According to the evidence, traces of the killer or killers were present in the attic. Cigarette remains, the presence of which was later disputed, where they were waiting. The door was closed from the inside and the windows as well. This confused the investigators. All the victims were found in their beds, with their heads covered by bedsheets. All of their skulls were hit 20 to 30 times with the sharp end of an axe, so much so that their brains were scattered everywhere. According to investigations, when everyone was asleep, the killer sneaked from the attic into the master bedroom, where Mr. and Mrs. Moore were sleeping. He struck Sarah and Josiah with the axe so many times that he cut Josiah's face and blew out his eyes. Evidence of this is the presence of gouge marks on the low ceiling of the room, as a result of the killer raising the axe and lowering his blade on the victim's body. After killing the parents, the killer went to the children's room and killed the 4 brothers with blows from a sharp axe. Before he returned to the master bedroom and repeated the blows to both parents. Then he went downstairs and killed the 2 sisters, Lena and Ina. Investigators believed that Lena was awake unlike everyone else during her murder. This was due to her lying crosswise on the bed, in addition to a defensive wound on her arm. They also noticed her dress, which was rolled up to the waist. They suspected that she had been subjected to sexual harassment, but subsequent examinations refuted this. Strange things were also found at the crime scene, the entire house. Investigators found a slice of bacon weighing about 4 pounds leaning next to the cleaned axe on the wall. The killer also searched dresser drawers for pieces of clothing to cover the mirrors, glass, and doors of the entire house. An oil lamp without a chimney was under the couple's bed. It is likely that the killer used it for lighting and then left it. On the kitchen table was a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of blood-stained water. After that, the investigators unanimously agreed that he washed his hands with it. There were no signs of any breakage or dislocation on the windows and doors. It is believed that the killer entered through the wooden back gate and left after closing all the doors, taking the house's keychain with him. Unfortunately, all the evidence and fingerprints at the crime scene were erased and lost. The police lost control of the house and left it unguarded and cordoned it off. Anyone who came and went would enter and touch things and corpses. One of them even took part of Josiah's shattered skull as a souvenir. A funeral service for the victims was held in the town square of Villisca on June 12, 1912, attended by thousands of residents of the town and beyond. Their coffins, which were not displayed during the funeral, were later transported on several carts to the Villisca cemetery for burial. The funeral procession was majestic and contained 50 vehicles. The people of the town of Villisca say that no one in this quiet town expected that such a heinous crime would be committed in Villisca. That day, they tried their best to search for the killer who disturbed the peace of their town. They recruited men and searched for him, on foot, on horses, and in cars, in every inch of the town and its suburbs, but to no avail. After the crime, the lives of the people changed radically. The town has turned into a hotbed for all journalists or curious people from all over the country, and even abroad. In addition, gossip, rumors, doubts, and divisions spread. Relations and friendships became strained among its residents, and accusations were made of this and that. Neighbors lost confidence among themselves, reinforced the locks on windows and doors, and carried weapons to protect themselves and their property openly. They also slept in gatherings for fear that the serial killer was free. The most prominent suspects in the Villisca Axe murders: Reverend Lynn, George Jacqueline Kelly, an English immigrant from a family of priests. He has a long history of mental disorder and sexual deviance. In 1914, he was once convicted of sending obscene material through the mail. He immigrated with his wife to America in 1904 and was appointed a traveling preacher to several communities north of Villisca. On the morning of June 10th, at about 5:30, Pastor George Kelly left the town of Villisca on the train heading west. This came after a night he spent part of at the Presbyterian Church to attend Children's Day activities. Later it was said in some testimonies that, while the priest was on the train, he spoke about the presence of 8 dead people in Villisca, killed in their beds while sleeping. This was hours before the bodies were discovered. 2 weeks later, Reverend George returned to the city and joined the investigation campaigns at the house as a Scotland Yard detective. His mysterious behavior and increasing interest in the case made him the focus of investigators' suspicions, in addition to testimonies saying that he was monitoring the Moore family on the Sunday before the crime. In 1917, he was accused of murdering the Moore family and spent the summer imprisoned pending investigation. On August 31st, he signed a petition confessing to the murder, including, I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way, but he later refuted it, claiming that he was under pressure from investigators. The investigations eventually reached a dead end. In the absence of conclusive evidence, he was acquitted in November after 2 separate trials, after which he disappeared from sight. Some crime historians believe that the mentally ill Reverend George Kelly is the most likely candidate to carry out the crime. This was done by linking his deviant sexual tendencies with Lena's dress, which was folded above her waist. It is expected that he killed an entire family just to enjoy seeing the girl's body parts. Frank Fernando Jones. Frank Fernando Jones was a resident of Villisca and an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore was his employee in his hardware store for several years. Senator Jones was the subject of suspicion based on at least 2 convincing reasons. The first was that he carried grudges and hatred for Josiah in his heart. This happened after he left work with him in 1907. He established his own business, taking with him the most prominent dealers in the store, and positioning himself as a strong competitor in front of him. The second is worse than the first, as rumors say that Josiah was having an affair with Frank Jones's beautiful daughter-in-law, Donna. He even slept with her too. Therefore, the relationship between Frank and Jones was so cold that they would avoid going through the same road in town. Detective James Wilkerson accused Jones and his son of committing the crime, or rather of hiring William Mansfield to do it. But they vehemently denied the accusation and insisted on their innocence, and were not tried after that. But he lost his position and lost his right to run for the Senate again. William Mansfield, born in Blue Island, Illinois, also known as George Worley. Mansfield was a serial killer and drug addict. He is the prime suspect in the Villisca Axe murders of the Burns Investigation Agency in Kansas City. In fact, its client, James Wilkerson, is determined to be the perpetrator, as we mentioned above. Wilkerson believes Mansfield is the perpetrator of the axe murders in Paola, Kansas. This was 4 days before the Villisca crime. He is also likely responsible for the axe murders of his wife, his infant child, and his wife's parents in Blue Island. This occurred on July 5, 1914, 2 years after the Moore family crime. Wilkerson based his investigations on the issue of pattern, as all murders were committed in the same way. In all of these crimes, mirrors were covered, and the victims were beaten to death with an axe. He also left a burning lamp by the bed, and a bloody water bowl was found in the kitchen. In 1916, he was arrested, and during the investigation, evidence from payrolls from his work was presented proving his absence from the Villisca crime scene, and he was released. But Wilkerson was convinced that Frank Jones was the one who pressured officials to do so. Mansfield later filed a lawsuit against Detective Wilkerson on charges of defamation and was awarded more than $200,000. Henry Lee Moore, another federal officer assigned to the Villisca Axe murders named McClory, had another theory. It is that Henry Lee Moore, no relation to Josiah, was responsible for all axe murders during that period. This is because Henry was convicted by conclusive evidence of killing his mother, who was 62 years old at the time. An 82-year-old woman found him months after the Villisca murder, and his weapon was an axe. Henry was born in Missouri on November 1, 1874. His father was a farmer and served in the Civil War. His mother was a nurse, and he had 3 brothers. He left the area and settled in 1900 in Franklin County, Iowa, on a farm where he worked as a farmer. He was later sentenced to prison on charges of forgery and was released from prison for a year in the spring of 1911. Then he fell in love with a 16-year-old girl from Columbia, but her father rejected him because he did not have a home. So he wrote to him that he would get his mother's house and money, considering that his father and brothers had died before that. On the night of December 17, 1912, he sneaked into her house to kill the 2 old women by smashing their heads with a rusty axe. Detective McClory supported his suspicions of Henry due to the axe crime spree that occurred in 1911 and early 1912. This happened after Henry Lee Moore was released from prison. One murder of 6 members of the Burnham and Wayne families in the same house in Colorado, and the axe was the murder weapon. On September 17th, 2. Murder M. Dawson with his wife and daughter in Illinois in October of the same year, also with an axe. 3. The axe murder of William Schumann, along with his wife and 3 children, also in October. 4. The axe murder of Ronald Hudson and his wife in Paola, Kansas, in June 1912. This was a few days before the Moore family and the Stillinger girls were murdered in Villisca. Until his release after 36 years, until his death in the early 60s. Henry was not convicted of these murders due to the absence of conclusive evidence, although many agreed that he was undoubtedly the perpetrator. In addition to the most prominent suspects, many of the strangers who entered the town were under suspicion and suspected of the Villisca Axe murders. The most famous of them is Andy Sawyer, who was just a passerby who got a job on the Burlington Railroad. On the morning of the murder, he bought a newspaper carrying news of the crimes and was very interested in it, according to what witnesses said. Some workers also said that he slept alone with an axe next to him. He also confided to them that he was in Villisca on the night of the crime, and because he feared he was a suspect, he left the place. Joe Rex was also one of the first suspects, after he was arrested coming off a train with blood-stained shoes. One of the Moore family girls, 16 years old. She confirmed that a stranger stopped her the day before the crime to ask her about Josiah Moore's family home. At the end of 1917, the police investigators and jurors surrendered. No one else was ever tried for the Villisca Axe murders. They continued to receive confessions in the years following the killings, including confessions from a prisoner in Detroit in 1931, who claimed that an unknown businessman had offered to pay him $5,000 to kill the Moore family. In the end, every clue and confession led to a dead end. Multiple theories about the Villisca Axe murder for more than a century. The Villisca Axe murder case was never closed. Many agency investigators, amateurs, writers, journalists, and even ordinary people have tried, over many years of their lives, to solve the mystery of this crime. Here, dear reader, are 3 of those theories. One, Mrs. Rita Johnson, a friend of Minnie Moore, the sister of the murdered Josiah, says that Mr. and Mrs. Moore were waiting for a guest that night. The evidence for this is the presence of an empty bed, arranged and prepared for reception, in the front room, which was never occupied. She also adds that as a result of what she saw of signs of a man sitting on cotton bags in the closet opposite the room of the Stillinger girls, if the Moores had turned around and checked the closet, they might have seen the guest killer and prevented the crime. She confirms that identifying the killer was based on examining part of a watch chain that was on the girl's bed. It is most likely that it was cut while Lena was resisting the killer. 2. In 1987, he published a review of the case, which was written by a journalist named Don Patton, a confusing and strange theory about the reasons for the murder of the Moore family. Its heroine is an old woman who calls her Mrs. Z. Mrs. Fosul narrates the story, saying that in 1911, the son of a prominent family from Villisca was killed in a riot in the state of Oklahoma. The body returned to the town accompanied by the husband's widow, but the dead man's parents, as a result of hostility between them, did not allow her to attend the funeral. The funeral director left 2 seats open at the front of the funeral room, minutes before it began, because they prevented the wife from getting there. One of the most prominent businessmen in town heard what was going on, so he led the widow to the seats and sat next to her until she finished. For the second time, she was prevented from going to the cemetery, but he also saved the situation. Here you may wonder, dear reader, then and after. What do the widow and her husband have to do with the Moore family? The answer is simply that Mrs. Z, whose sanity is confirmed by writer Don Patton, said that the widow left town with blind hatred towards her in-laws and vowed revenge. So she sent a man to kill the family, but he missed the house. The target family's home is supposed to be 11 houses north of the Presbyterian Church. but the killer entered the house 11 houses east of the same church. Could it be that a mistake in directions led to the death of an entire family? Bill James says in his 2017 book, The Man on the Train, which included explanations for the axe murders that spread in America at that time, especially in the Midwest. The killer was one man. If the interpretation is correct, then, as he put it, he will be considered the worst serial killer in the history of America, better than Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy themselves. It would have claimed the lives of more than 100 people in a horrific and inhumane way. Bell's theory is that the killer was traveling on the railway line that connects most of the cities where the crimes occurred. He was a serial killer who chose his victims at random and enjoyed smashing their heads with an axe. Bell also attributes the investigators' inability to find evidence that leads them to the perpetrator to the lack of connection between the crimes. The absence of the FBI at that time, as well as federal crime databases. Also, most of the investigations came from the small town department and a few investigators, most of whom were amateurs and crooks. In addition to this, there was the beginning of forensic science at that time, the modernity of fingerprint records, and the police's reliance on dogs and primitive methods of investigation. Most important of all is distorting the features of the crime scene. We conclude this sad story with the history of the Moore family home in Villisca. The Moore house, where the 1912 murders occurred, was built in the mid-19th century, specifically in 1868. The Moore family bought it in 1903. After their deaths, the house was owned by 8 people until it was purchased by Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Lane in 1994. By then, the house had deteriorated badly and was on the verge of collapse. However, the 2 masters restored the old house to its original condition at the time of the crimes. In 1998, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Currently, it is a hotel open for tours and overnight stays due to its fame in terms of the crimes committed there. On the other hand, it is classified as one of the top 10 haunted places in America. The house is said to have a long history of paranormal events. According to eyewitnesses, most of whom were tenants, they said that they experienced paranormal and strange situations, including, in turn, the presence of a man carrying an axe standing under their bed, and their seeing pictures of blood-stained shoes, sounds of closet doors opening and children crying, and clothes being taken from the closets and scattered on the floor of the rooms. A man said that while sharpening his knife, the latter suddenly turned around and stabbed him in the thumb, as if someone had the ability to control his wrist. Others suffered from falling lamps, a feeling of heaviness, the sounds of dripping blood, the sounds of moving objects and violent blows, reporting of screams, unexplained movements, and even a strange fog surrounding the house. Hearing strange sounds and movements in the attic. It is reported that a woman tried to go up, but an unknown force prevented her from going up. In 2014, paranormal explorer Robert Stephen stabbed himself in the chest area in the haunted house for a reason no one knows. This is at 1245. That is, at the same time as the plagues that Josiah received more than a century ago. On the other hand, there are those who actually lived in the house and assert that they did not witness any paranormal activities. Rather, it gained its fame and status after 1999, when the Nebraska Ghost Hunters program described it as a haunted house. He became famous after that. It is considered a haven for all ghost hunters and paranormal explorers in America, even though its owners stripped it of electricity, gas, and water. Darwin Lane died in July 2011. His wife, Martha, sold the contents of the house at auction in 2012, but kept the house open as a tourist attraction. As for the famous Villisca Axe, which spilled a lot of ink, it is in the collection of the State Museum in Des Moines, America. In conclusion, the Villisca Axe murders are classified as one of the most horrific unsolved mass murders in America.